All right, here's a few news articles I thought were interesting. This one is pretty interesting. There is something called Tailscale, which is a pretty interesting product. It's a point-to-point VPN, a mesh network VPN apparently, which was I was not aware of this, and I'm not entirely sure exactly why you'd use it, but you go on a WireGuard network going through other people's machines, so it sounds a little bit like Tor, where all the people are carrying other people's traffic, I guess to further anonymize it or something. But anyway, there's a process called Tailscale D, and this daemon trusts what it gets from DNS, and it uses the same origin policy, apparently, because that makes it subject to DNS rebinding. This is a fairly complicated attack, although now there are some tools that do it pretty efficiently, where you answer one DNS request with your real DNS, with your real IP address, so it can load data from that site. But then the next DNS address you lie and claim to be at 127.0.0.1. So the same origin policy stops working, and you can load script from a web server and then execute it against things on your local host, things in your local network. And because of that, they were able to reach an API that was not protected in that case and dump out secrets. So they've updated it. So anybody using Tailscale should update to the newest version. But it's a clever attack, and I've seen various ways to try it out. And one thing about this is a whole lot of Internet of Things devices are vulnerable to this. There's a lot of Internet of Things devices that assume that if traffic comes from the local network, it's authorized. And if it's coming from the internet, it's unauthorized. And so a DNS reminding attack can also be used to trick a web script into running against those devices. So that's more about the same thing. So this was kind of interesting. There's a lot of these famous memes, like a lot of them mashed together here. And it turns out that most of these are copyrighted by the owner. Like this is a picture of somebody's 11-month-old kid at the beach, and so are the others. The people own them, and they talk about it. It's an interesting issue of American law. So if people just make memes and share them on the internet, on social networks and such, then that actually makes it more popular and more valuable. So even though they probably could sue to complain about that, they don't, and people say that's fair use. But if you put it on a branded product and sell it to make money, then they will typically sue and demand some of that money. And so they're talking about the legal issue of this, where technically using it without permission is under certain conditions considered okay and other conditions considered not okay. So it's interesting to learn the limits. Cobalt Strike. First there was Metasploit, which we use in the pen testing classes, the free product that makes it easy to automate attacks. Then there was Armitage, which puts a graphical interface on Metasploit with Java, so you can just drag and drop things to do attacks. And that's also free. It has a free and a pay version. And then there's Cobalt Strike, which is a very expensive, very restricted commercial product used by serious pen testers. And because it's very powerful and it's designed to bypass antivirus engines, criminals will crack old versions of Cobalt Strike and put up cracked versions, which they use in real malware. And this is a problem. So what they're doing now is they're publishing information to detect the old versions of Cobalt Strike, but not the latest version. That's the latest plan. So they will give you Yara rules and VirusTotal rules so you can detect old versions of Cobalt Strike, and the idea being that pen testers would have the latest version, but criminals would have the older version. So this would be a way to stop the bad guys without stopping the good guys. So it's an interesting idea. We'll see what comes of it. So this is a really common flaw in apps. I don't think we've had students find an app with this flaw this semester, but it's pretty easy. You can just find hard-coded passwords, and I know we had some projects where you found this in like a CTF type app. But another thing people often have is API keys. I found a lot of apps with API keys in it, but the problem is I'm not easily able to tell which API keys are dangerous and which ones aren't. API keys are identifiers used to authenticate with a service, but some of those are sort of harmless, like to deliver ads. Others are important to like take down servers and do things that spend money. And you have to research the specific service to find out which API keys are important. But anyway, these guys found a whole bunch of APIs for this thing called Algolia, a proprietary platform, and found a lot of websites that are leaking that key. It's quite common that there are hard-coded secrets in mobile apps. And I know that GitHub, I think, will now detect these automatically when you put up GitHub repositories containing things that look like things that should be kept secret. But I don't think Android development environments warn you yet, so it's a pretty common mistake developers make. And this one is an interesting company. Now, and I'm going to apologize later when we get to the lecture. We're going to talk about iOS, and you don't have any hands-on iOS projects. And the reason you don't is because there's no free iOS emulator. Like we have these Android emulators we're using, like in Android Studio, and there's not an iOS emulator we can use. And there is one, however, that exists, and it is this company, Corellium. They make an iOS emulator, but they charge a lot of money for it. But they make an iOS emulator, and it's very useful for the community, and they keep getting sued by Apple. And they seem to think they're going to survive the lawsuits from Apple, but while preparing for the lawsuits, Apple did perform opposition research on them, and they found out that they had been engaging with controversial companies like the Israeli company NSO Group, which has pretty much been destroyed. I think it's completely out of business now because they sold dangerous malware to repressive governments, while claiming they were only going to like NATO members, but they weren't. They were giving it to very disturbing countries like the United Arab Emirates and Russia. And they're trying to say that Corellium has also done things like this because they gave it to NSO Group and NSO Group passed it on. So I don't know all the details, but it's suggesting that they're guilty of being a bad actor. And so we'll see what happens. But anyway, I wish they would offer a free academic version. Maybe they will someday. But I think they're, right now they're just battling to survive against Apple's lawsuits. If you want something to do over the holidays, when you don't have classes anymore, there are a lot of these special capture the flag and training competitions available. This one's from TryHackMe, which is very popular with the students. It costs some amount of money per month, but they have free stuff, and here's a free one, 24 free lessons and hands-on projects to do called The Advent of Cyber. So that would be a good thing to do. There's another one that's very popular, the Sans Holiday Hack Challenge. They make this really much like a game where you're wandering around and opening doors and finding people that talk to you and stuff. And then they have little videos you watch, and then they have puzzles you have to solve. And so people really like this one. This one is extremely popular. I've never liked it too much, but other people really like it. So you might check those things out. They're good things to do to give you some learning to do over the break, if you got nothing better to do. And this one was interesting. This is something I've heard for years. If you are a pen tester and you find, say, a vulnerability in some service, like some old version of something, and then you realize there's a CVE saying that has a vulnerability, you don't have the exploit, you can Google and find some GitHub repository. Somebody has put up a proof of concept exploit. The problem is some of those contain malware. And these guys went and tested that, and they found that indeed 10% of them include malware that will do something bad to you. Which is, I've always heard it's dangerous, and you really have to check those things out first. But I don't know anybody that actually checked how dangerous they are. And they tried GitHub known vulnerabilities over the last 5 years, and they found that about 10% of them will either exfiltrate data from the system or install malware on the system. So that's a known fact. I mean, in general, whenever you're getting a hacking tool, it's like getting a pirated piece of software. You should know that's a risky thing to do, and you should test it and be aware. Run it on disposable virtual machine and things like that. Downloading somebody else's random stuff intended for hacking, it's a pretty good chance it's going to be malicious. All right. And so they're going to be much cheaper cars. One thing about Teslas is they cost a lot. They're getting cheaper, but they still cost a lot. And now they're getting a whole series of cars down in the $20,000 range, which is much more reasonable. The Hyundai Kona is $22,000. The electric is $50,000. The Kona is burning gas. And same with the F-150. But now there is a new generation of cheaper ones, and this one's a Fiat from Italy, which is going to sell for something like $20,000. And I don't really know anything about Fiats, but I've heard of them being very famous. I thought they were pretty expensive and pretty good. So that sounds like a pretty good alternative to paying a whole lot for an electric car. So that's a thought, $22,000 electric car. So we'll see. Certainly making it cheaper will improve adoption. And so everybody is madder than hell at Elon Musk. I've pretty much withdrawn from Twitter, and so has pretty much everybody else, because in addition to driving all the security professionals away so there's nobody to talk to, he's now bringing back Kanye West and Trump, and he's spreading anti-gay conspiracy theories and hate speech, and so is everybody else. It's all full of people doing hate speech, especially towards gays and transgender, but I'm sure other people pretty soon. And the point is, it's just turning into a rotten neighborhood like 4chan, not worth being in. And but here's an interesting issue. This person says Elon Musk is the good guy on the issue of child sexual exploitation. Apparently there is pornography on Twitter. I've heard there's a lot of it. I haven't seen it. And apparently there is child porn on Twitter. That's what they're saying. And they say they've been child porn on Twitter for years, and they couldn't get Twitter to pay any attention. And when they contacted Elon Musk, he promised to do something about it right away. Of course, when Elon Musk promises something, it means absolutely nothing. It's like when Donald Trump promises something. He just promises something and then an hour later does the opposite and forgets about it. Like he promised not to let Trump on or anybody back until he had a committee to enforce clear rules, and then he just totally ignored that, canceled it, and did the opposite. So, but anyway, they say they couldn't even get anybody to answer them with the old team with their complaints about child sexual exploitation, and they feel like Elon is taking it more seriously. So that's one of the few people saying that Elon Musk is actually doing something good on Twitter. And the San Jose Mercury News has a doomsday scenario saying, since the pandemic, the number of people actually physically going to work has gone way down. Everybody's just connecting from home, like most of you are. And that means there's nobody riding the subway and BART and everything else and the Muni, and therefore they don't have enough money. And they're talking about how it's going to, if this doesn't change, they're going to have to, by I think 2025, pretty much decimate all the commuter vehicles, all the public rail, down to nothing, like BARTs once an hour instead of every 15 minutes, and similar cuts everywhere. So it sounds quite reasonable and quite true. I think the pandemic really hit them hard. And all right, I think we won't bother with this one because we're up to the official time. So let me just stop the recording.